Spellbound is the 15th episode of the 5th season of Cheers. This is, of course, directed by the wonderful James Burrows, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode chronologically and share some thoughts. And it's a pretty good episode. For me personally, I actually really loved the very small subplot more, but I'll talk about that in a moment. In fact, I'll talk about it just now because it's at the opening of the episode. It starts off with Norm and Frasier playing chess. And by tremendous coincidence, I think either earlier this week or late last week, I watched the Frasier episode, Chess Pains. Really brilliant episode about Frasier playing chess with Martin. And it's a very similar narrative with, in that episode, I don't want to say too much about it, but obviously I'm going to be talking about it in this episode. So there will probably be some spoilers for Chess Pains in this episode discussion as well. But basically, things don't go Frasier's way, and it's really interesting to see Frasier responding to that in this episode and comparing it to how he did in that episode, and that's something that I think is really fascinating. And it does happen occasionally with Cheers. We will see episodes of Frasier where there's something similar happening to something that's happened to Frasier in Cheers, and I just find that to be so fun. I will come back to this when we get there chronologically. We actually do carry on at pretty much the same time after we have the intro. Frasier is now playing chess with Woody, and then Loretta comes in crying, looking for Carla. And she does this amazing thing where I think it's something we can all relate to, where she says she's fine and she's being really pleasant, but she's sobbing while she's saying it. And I think it's just this human inability to answer honestly when somebody asks us how we are, even if it's very clear that we're not fine. We then find out that Nick has been cheating on her. Carla doesn't have the most helpful response. Diane tries to help her. I don't think Loretta knows how she wants to handle this because Diane is trying to encourage her to talk about it, and I had to laugh. It's obviously a heartbreaking thing for Loretta to be going through, but Diane asks Loretta how she's feeling, and she should talk about how she's feeling, and Loretta just declares, "I'm against it," which I thought was saying it as it is. If you're gonna say how you feel about somebody cheating on you, that's about as blunt as it can get. We find out very briefly that Woody is winning at playing chess against Frasier. Frasier is obviously not happy about this. And then Carla and Diane, slightly reluctantly on Carla's part, maybe a little too reluctantly on Diane's part, end up staying after hours in the bar with Loretta, and they have a really nice heart-to-heart, and I think that that's very well written. It's very well filmed. We just have the three of them sitting around this one table, and I think it works really well. We also have a brilliant quote from Diane, which I thought was absolutely fabulous, and she describes Nick as a man that quicksand would spit up, which I thought was fantastic. Diane often has a very colourful way of describing things, and that has to be one of my new favourites. We find out that also before Loretta started dating Nick, she was potentially going to have a promising singing career. At least that's what she had envisioned for herself, and she wants to sing again. And I think it's quite telling that she had to give that up when she became more serious with Nick, and I think that that's a tremendous shame. Now, whether that's because Nick told her to, or because she didn't feel like she could, either way, that should not have happened, and Diane says that she's going to have a word with Sam to convince him to let Loretta sing at the bar. There was a missed opportunity. Diane says, I didn't write it down, but it's something to the effect of I can convince Sam to do anything, and I was waiting for Carla to say something, to reply with a retort about how she'd convinced him to marry her, but she didn't. Maybe they did and they had to cut it out for time, but certainly I was left wanting a response from Carla. We then cut to Diane asking Sam, who says no, and eventually he does say, yes, fine, you can sing. We have a brief moment with Cliff. Cliff is only in this episode very briefly, and then Nick comes into it, and we have this really well-written exchange between Nick and Carla, where they're throwing insults at each other, and as soon as Nick came in, things just became really slimy. He is such a slimy character. The performance is amazing, but he really does give me the creeps, and Sam and Diane end up telling Nick to leave because he was not doing anything to help the situation. He was not doing anything for the benefit of Loretta. And Loretta hugs Sam because she's so overjoyed that he stood up for her. And that as well is very telling, because that indicates that Nick has never done that for Loretta. Or if he has, it's not a frequent occurrence. And Nick is pretending to be angry. At least I think he's pretending that Loretta hugged Sam. He's thinking that Sam has stolen his woman. And again, I think this is all Nick acting. So he says, "You took my woman." And we cut to Diane's expression, which is amazing. And then Nick says, "I'm going to take yours." I think the pacing of just the delivery of that line was fabulous. And okay, I read the next line in my notes. And it's funny, I promise. Diane replies, the only thing you should be taking is penicillin." It's amazing. It's funnier when Diane says it, but very, very entertaining. And he literally tries to hypnotize her and tells her all of these things, and then ends by saying, "Oh, and bring a 6-pack." He leaves. Diane obviously hasn't been hypnotized by this, and the next thing we see is Woody, bless his heart, just almost at the back of the scene. It's not in the foreground, it's just kind of in the back, walking behind the bar towards the exit with a 6-pack of beer. And it's just the cutest moment ever. We then have some more chess with Woody and Frasier. And Frasier declares that up until this point he'd been going easy on Woody. And he is having a very similar response to how he reacted with Martin. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but it's so fascinating to see Frasier basically in the exact same situation, playing chess against somebody he thinks he should be very easily able to beat. And honestly, although the episodes are not identical, his response is. But on this occasion, Woody does checkmate him, and Frasier throws the board. I think the only reason he didn't do that with the episode with Martin is because that chess set was very, very expensive, whereas I think the chess set they're playing with at Cheers is just a bog standard everyday chess set. Frasier has his tantrum, and then Nick comes in and he presents this, what looks like fine dining, and musicians with violins follow him in, and everybody's really smartly dressed. Nick does look very well dressed, and he tries to serenade Diane, and Diane's not falling for this. And then Loretta comes in to get something she left at Cheers, and Nick immediately casts Diane aside and tells Loretta that this was all for her. He is so fake, and it is so disgusting and slimy, and yet when he's talking, I believe him. And he's saying all of these nice things to Loretta. And I think he sounds sincere. And that is, of course, Nick's whole personality. He's good at fooling certain women into thinking that they're his one and only. Meanwhile, he is a slimeball. And what I love is that Loretta, yes, she started to fall for it. But then she realised the cake on the table said Nick and Diane. And she declares, "This wasn't for me after all, was it?" And I think Loretta is going through a lot of growth in this episode in particular, but actually we have seen bits and pieces of this over the episodes when she's appeared. But she's finally starting to realise that everything Nick is saying, it's just a game for him. And she's had enough and she leaves. And then Carla comes along, and Nick immediately pretends it's for Carla. And for a second, it looks like she's falling for it. But she's not, and she treats him in a way that I think he absolutely deserves. And then something happens, and I'm not 100% sure that I agree with it. Everybody has abandoned Nick. Diane comes back into the room, and she tells him to go after Loretta. And she tells him to tell Loretta that she is the only woman for him, and to say all of these things that I think out of anybody else's mouth would actually be believable. But Diane's telling Nick to go and say all of these things to Loretta, and yes, they are the right words to say, but I don't think Nick would be sincere about them, and I don't necessarily think Diane thinks Nick thinks their truth. So I don't really agree with her telling him to go after Loretta to say these things. Yes, work hard in your marriage, save it where you can, but at the same time, Diane's basically telling Nick that he should be with Loretta, and I think Loretta deserves somebody better. So I don't necessarily agree with that, but at the same time, if one wanted to argue that Diane is encouraging Nick to work at his marriage, then yes, I can understand that. But actually, I think Loretta deserves better, and I'm not saying that she should go through a divorce, but I don't think just telling Nick to go after her and say all of the right things, even if he doesn't mean it, is necessarily the right solution. Nevertheless, that's what happens. Sam comes in because his TV is broken at home, and we have a beautiful moment where Sam and Diane embrace, and Diane clicks her fingers, which is a little bit rude, but for the episode it works well because the musicians begin to play the wonderful music again, and it's just a gorgeous way to end the episode. So definitely a fun episode in a lot of ways. I think kind of moving as well. If you can relate to Loretta, that didn't come out right. Relate to Loretta, and maybe there's some food for thought there about how somebody might be treating you, as we see with Nick and Loretta. And as I said, for me, the most fun part was Frasier playing chess, because I have literally within the last week watched Chess Pains, and just being able to compare them is just so much fun. And to be honest, there's not a lot of actual contrasting, because the behaviour of Frasier is just so similar. And I rather enjoyed that a lot. If you're a fan of Frasier and you don't remember that episode very well, and you've just watched this episode of Cheers, I thoroughly recommend going and watching Chess Pains. I recommend it anyway, but doing the comparison, tremendous fun. And this episode is really great. I mean, I'd say that with pretty much every Cheers episode, but nevertheless, Spellbound is a really great episode.